So lesson 4, topic 5, the Cuban Missile Crisis, a continuation of where we left off. We know that there was trouble in Cuba, and just to sort of reiterate, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion that we talked about last lesson really showed how vulnerable Castro was to American interference. Not only that, it was evidently clear, not only because of the Bay of Pigs, but the multitude of other interactions that the U.S., particularly the CIA, had with Cuba, seemed to indicate that the USA's intention was pretty much remove Castro at all costs. Therefore, with support of the USSR, Castro's government would be more likely to survive. And basically, it's a pretty simple calculation. Cuba on its own cannot defend against the USA, therefore it needs to buddy up with another superpower. And to do so, he, of course, approaches Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviet Union, who are altogether more willing to help for a number of reasons. So let's take a look at those reasons. Why would the USSR risk angering the United States to the degree it does over Cuba, especially considering the fact that Kennedy was drawing a pretty hard line that nuclear missiles in Cuba would be seen as an act of aggression leading to war? Now, the first reason we need to consider those that are political. In the USSR, Khrushchev was viewed as not as aggressive towards America, perhaps even a bit weak. He had come to power slowly after Stalin's death in 1953 and really had achieved power firmly by 1955, and then talks about very openly in what becomes known as the secret speech, his willingness to de-Stalinize and remove some of the oppressive terror and repression that had characterized Soviet rule under Stalin. Those hardliners in the party who liked the terror and repression, who thought that that was the only way to maintain the communist revolution, automatically disagreed with Khrushchev. They felt he was weak. He appeased the Americans, and that they started to worry that the Soviets were always on the losing side, especially after the Americans had closed or completely turned the table on the missile gap by the early 1960s, especially with technology. Khrushchev also needs to send a message that he's strong. Really, if he supported an ally in Cuba, it would act as another deterrent against the Americans, especially in an attack like the Bay of Pigs. There are military reasons as well. The USSR does not necessarily have close enough bases on which to strike the Americans. It has some intercontinental ballistic missiles which can hit some cities on the coast of America from either the Pacific side or the Atlantic side. However, unlike the Americans, who have allies and bases very, very close to mainland Russia, the Soviets don't have the same bases close to America. And there are many areas in America, particularly in the middle of America, where a lot of America's military infrastructure is, that are completely untouchable to Soviet weapons. So there's the idea that if you put missiles in Cuba, basically all of America would be under threat from Soviet nuclear missiles. The USA also had missiles in Turkey. And of course, the proximity of Turkey to the Soviet Union, just across the Black Sea, is a real threat to the Soviet Union. Famously, Khrushchev stands on the beach on the coast of the Black Sea near modern-day Sochi, and one of his aides say to him, "You see that over there?" And Khrushchev says, "What? What do I see?" He said, "That is Turkey." And you know what is in Turkey? Nuclear missiles that are American. And Khrushchev really gets uncomfortable when he realizes the proximity of those nuclear missiles, and wants to sort of equalize the playing field by putting Soviet nuclear missiles as uncomfortably close to the USA as the American missiles in Turkey were. And of course, this is all about reducing the advantage the United States would have in the event of a nuclear war. All of this leaves Kennedy with a few interesting options. The 13-day crisis, known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, that evolves from the time Soviet missiles are discovered in Cuba, up into the point that they're eventually removed, is of course known as the, sometimes some people call it the October Crisis. It's most commonly known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. When he learns of the missiles, Kennedy is really faced with a number of different options. And his different options are each with their own risks and each with their own upsides. He first and foremost appoints a committee of advisors. He sets up 12 of these advisors, and this advisory committee is led by his brother, a man named Robert Kennedy, who famously will try and run for president in 1968, but is sadly assassinated just like his brother. Option number one, of course, is to bomb Cuba and the Soviet Union using nuclear missiles. This is just preemptive strike. We have the advantage before they set it up. Let's just wipe them off the face of the earth. And obviously, there is the sort of destructive element of that, risky, a nuclear holocaust, et cetera, et cetera. This is probably the most aggressive and the most dangerous option. The second one is the invasion of Cuba. An invasion would get rid of the missiles and Castro. However, I suppose the American forces are already ready and able to do it. It would also ultimately mean that the Soviets would respond to protect Cuba. And this is likely to be a complete takeover of Berlin. Potential nuclear strike is there, but not necessarily. If the Americans go nuclear in Cuba, that's unlikely the Soviet Union would, but it would definitely mean that the Soviets would invade Berlin as a response to this. The other one is a surgical air attack, okay? Selected air attack only aimed at those nuclear bases. So of course, this would destroy the nuclear missile bases before they're ready to use, but of course, there are lots of problems with this. There's no guarantee it's going to work. Even one undamaged missile site can launch a counterattack. It would kill Soviet soldiers, which would probably bring the Russians and the Americans to a state of war. And not only that, to attack sort of surprise and without warning is seen as a moral and counter to the rules of war, which the Americans, of course, try and live up to at this particular point. Another option, of course, is blockading Cuba. Okay, this is basically banning the Soviet Navy from bringing any further missile supplies to Cuba, forming a ring around the island. It would show the U.S. was serious. It wouldn't be a direct act of war. It would put the burden on Khrushchev to turn his ships around. And the USA, with this power of its Navy, if things were to get out of hand, could still put forth a pretty strong nuclear reaction. I guess, the downside of this, it wouldn't solve the main problem. There are missiles on Cuba. The sites are still on Cuba. They could be used within a week, and the Soviets could, again, blockade Berlin as a sort of retaliatory measure to this. There's the use of diplomatic pressure. Okay, you can go to the United Nations, hopefully trying to avoid conflict. But doing this would put the USA's foreign policy in the hands of the United Nations and other countries. It would be a sign of weakness. It would be a sign of the US backing down. And then, of course, the last one is do nothing at all. The Americans could say, okay, whatever, we still have greater nuclear power. The standoff would continue. More or less, doing nothing would also be seen as a sign of weakness. And Kennedy, of course, is also conscious of being seen as weak. So what is ultimately decided, as you probably know, is that it was a blockade. They decided that there would be a quarantine around Cuba. 3,300 kilometers of water would be guarded by a U.S. ship every mile. Or rather, every kilometer thereabouts. A fleet of submarines is put on alert. 156 intercontinental ballistic missiles were aimed and made ready and primed for launch against the Soviet Union should they react poorly. Air Force bombers are put in the air 24 hours a day carrying nuclear weapons so that if a nuclear strike was needed, they would be ready to deploy immediately. Soldiers are placed on combat alert, and Air Force planes are consistently monitoring seas around Cuba to prevent and to check if the Soviets are trying to sneak anything in. The 22nd of October, Kennedy makes a television address. With the blockade in place, he decides that it's absolutely imperative at this particular point that he gets a message across to Khrushchev. And since there's no formal communication between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, he knows that the best way to communicate with Khrushchev is for himself to go on American TV, knowing that the Soviets would be watching the American TV, and to make a message to the American people about the situation, but also in that message disguise it to Khrushchev. So he does go on national TV, and he warns Khrushchev that if the Soviet convoy approaching Cuba was to go through this blockade, A, would it be permitted to, those ships would be sunk immediately, and B, that it would be considered an act of war. He basically said a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union, and in that meaning, we will launch a nuclear war against you if you run this blockade. And this message obviously trickles back to Khrushchev, because on the next day, the 23rd of October, Kennedy receives a letter from Khrushchev that says Soviet ships would not observe the blockade. They didn't care what Kennedy said on TV, and he does not admit the presence of nuclear missiles in Cuba. So as at this particular point, Kennedy's incredibly worried, and the tension levels here go absolutely as high as they possibly could in terms of the Cold War tension and the potential threat of war. On the 24th of October, the blockade begins. Okay, the first missile-carrying ships are accompanied by a Soviet submarine. They approach the blockade zone, and then, interestingly enough, on the morning of the 24th, those ships actually turn around. At 10:32 a.m., the 20 Soviet ships carrying the missiles that are closest to the zone actually stop right where they are, or they turn around. Kennedy, on the 25th of October, will believe that he's won. However, by the 25th of October, aerial photographs of the missile bases in Cuba actually show that the Soviets and the Cubans are actually building missile bases still. So the potential for the Soviets to have missiles in Cuba, even though they didn't run the blockade, still exists. Okay, could they build the missiles themselves in Cuba? Are they being snuck in by a submarine? The Americans don't really know. What we know is we stopped the surface vessels from getting through the blockade. So tension is still very, very high, which brings us to the interesting arguments of what happens on the 26th and 27th of October. Kennedy, on the 26th of October, received a very long and personal letter from Khrushchev. In this, he's quite bellicose in his rhetoric, which means aggressive in his rhetoric. He says that the missiles are purely defensive, but I will remove the missiles if the blockade is removed, and there is a promise not to invade Cuba. He admits at this point, for the first time, that there is Soviet nuclear weapons in Cuba, something that the Americans had tried to get the Russians to admit, because they had, of course, seen the evidence of this via aerial photographs, but the Russians had said there are no nuclear missiles. The letter on the 26th of October is a personal admission from Khrushchev. What's even more interesting is that on the 27th of October, there's a second letter. And on the second letter, Khrushchev revises what he said the day before. He says that the conditions for removing missiles in Turkey would be that the U.S. from Cuba would be that the U.S. remove theirs from Turkey. That same day, interestingly enough, a U.S. spy plane is shot down over Cuba, and the crisis worsens. The pilot's killed. The president is advised by his advisors to launch an immediate reprisal attack in Cuba, which, of course, he delays doing. Now, just a quick note about the letters on the 26th and the 27th of October. It's still largely unclear to this day, but Kennedy decides that he's going to ignore the second letter, but accept the terms of the first one. The belief was that in the midst of this crisis, that Khrushchev was having his power threatened. And Kennedy was clever enough to read between the lines and see that there were differences in tone and the way that the letters are written to indicate that potentially the letter on the 26th and the letter on the 27th was written by two different people. Perhaps that the Soviet military had begun to take over and had begun to sideline Khrushchev in the Soviet power structure, which of course was always very confusing and very, very quiet and shady. Now, Kennedy believes that the letter on the 26th is from Khrushchev himself, so he decides to actually follow this one. Really, the urging of his brother, Robert Kennedy, on this matter forces Kennedy to accept the terms of the first one. He adds that the Soviets don't respond positively to his intention to follow the terms of the first letter, he would invade Cuba. And therefore, Khrushchev accepts the offer based on the terms of the letter of the 26th of October. The U.S. agrees to remove its missiles from Turkey, but only long after the missiles from Cuba are removed. And interestingly enough, he also says that, and this is an important point, that they're going to do it in secret. And he does that so that the Soviets aren't able to use the removal of missiles from Turkey as a propaganda coup to show that they got one up on the United States. So eventually Kennedy actually gets Khrushchev to back down here. And what are the results of the crisis? So after the 28th of October, the crisis is effectively over. Okay, the Soviet missiles in Cuba are put on ships. They had to be put on the top of the ships so that the American planes could fly over and photograph the missiles actually leaving to prove that they are. It's a bit of a humiliation for Khrushchev. However, the world does back down from the brink of nuclear war. And the U.S. was relatively successful in containing the threat of communism, at least the threat of nuclear-armed communism from staying in Cuba. They were however, unable to overthrow Castro or stop a communist country being formed on their border. Oh, sorry. Anyways, long story short, it's a success for containment. Kennedy, again, is the winner. He's acclaimed as a great statesman. He stood up to the hardliners in his government, and he was able to sort of prove that his sort of containment strategy was the way forward. And in fact, turning back communists, intervening and invading isn't worth the risk. On some aspects, though, it's a failure for containment. He did secretly agree to remove missiles from Turkey, as I say. They had hoped that Castro would be gone, that Cuba would not go back to being communist, but he basically has to accept as a condition of the Cuban Missile Crisis that Cuba would remain a communist country. And that was the way until 2016, up until recently, that Barack Obama overturned the U.S. restrictions in place against Cuba. And of course, we know that Cuba is a hot button topic today within the sort of aftermath of the recent death of Fidel Castro, that Cuba and the situation of American restrictions on Cuba, of course, is very much up for debate. Stay tuned. On the other side, the USSR. So how is it a success for containment in terms of America's approach to them? Number one, Khrushchev is forced to back down, and it's really a victory for Kennedy. The Soviet military leadership gets incredibly upset at the premier of the Soviet Union at the terms of the withdrawal. As I said, they were forced to put missiles on the top decks of their ships so the American planes could count them. They felt basically humiliated. This really contributes more than anything else to the fact that Khrushchev is forced from power in 1964, and it really shows the victory of the American policy over that of Nikita Khrushchev in the years 1955 to 1964. On the other hand, as I said, it's sort of a victory in a sense for the USSR and a failure of containment. Khrushchev had kept Cuba safe from American invasion, which is, I suppose, a major achievement for the Soviets. Cuba becomes a valuable ally throughout the Cold War. They will help and establish communist revolutions all over South America, contrary to the wishes of the United States. Countries like Honduras, Bolivia will all undergo communist revolutions, and there will be communist disturbances all over the Central and South America throughout the 1960s, 70s, and into the 1980s. The USSR would continue to develop their stockpiles of missiles. It would never catch up with the US, but they would continue to build them. And it was also a little bit of a shock to the U.S. prestige internationally, as some of its allies actually disagreed with its tactics in the U.S. and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Britain is a really good example. Britain actually supported the USSR to some degree, saying it was unfair that the USA would be able to have missiles in Turkey, but the USSR couldn't have theirs in Cuba. So Kennedy's harsh stance wasn't necessarily supported by some of its Western European allies. So to that degree, they started to, let's say, break the bonds of loyalty formed during the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan with some of its Western European allies. For Cuba, of course, to a degree, it's a success for containment. Castro is forced to accept that the USSR had made a deal with the USA that they would be a junior partner, and they basically would have to live with this deal. And he needed that support from the USSR, so it weakened the position of Castro internationally, for that matter. It's also a failure for containment in the USA because, of course, as I said a couple times, Cuba stays communist. It stays relatively highly armed, not with nuclear missiles, but with other advanced Soviet weaponry. Castro keeps control of the American companies that had been nationalized during the Cuban Revolution, and there's never any talk of any of those American companies going back to the USSR. And a lot of these companies end up working for the Cuban government, becoming incredible sources of income for that Cuban government. A couple interesting points to make before we end the lesson on the Cuban Missile Crisis, that it does have some other important consequences beyond just the study of containment. One of the major results of the crisis is that it improved communication. It ensured that leaders could directly communicate rather than rely on letters. Therefore, to do so, a telephone link was established. It was known as the Red Phone, and it linked the White House and the Kremlin. It's known as the Red Phone because it would contact the Reds, the red communists, yada yada. The phone itself isn't actually red, which is a great misconception, but it is called the red phone, and it's a direct link that the Kennedy or whoever the president of the United States may be can pick up the phone at any time from 1962 onwards and get a direct line to the Soviet leadership via the red phone. That is to prevent tension and misunderstandings. Such was the case, and the danger of the two letters that came on the 25th and 26th of October, that they needed to establish a firmer connection to get around potential conflicts, or potentially even as I developed a military coup. A couple of interesting other points come out of it. The fact that some nuclear treaties are signed, and in many ways, there was a little bit of a lessening of tensions. Historians generally agree that the Cuban Missile Crisis helped to thaw or to lessen Cold War tensions, even though it raised them at its height to the highest point it had ever been. The leaders basically saw this sort of game of brinksmanship, of going to the edge of nuclear war, had almost actually ended the nuclear war, and they're more prepared to take steps to sort of reduce the risk, okay? The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty signed in 1963 doesn't really stop the development of nuclear weapons, but it limits tests, and it's at least an important step forward in slowing down the arms race. You also get the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, and this is to stop the spread of nuclear weapons, okay? The nations that signed this treaty were the nations with nuclear weapons, and they agreed not to develop, the nations that signed this treaty were forced to by the nations with nuclear weapons to sign this treaty and agree not to develop nuclear weapons of their own. And this would mean that only a very small group of countries that had, I suppose, responsible enough governments would own nuclear weapons. All of this, of course, leads to sort of that, like I said, a thaw. There's a little bit of a warming relations. The U.S. will sell grain to the USSR during a grain shortage in the 1960s, and there's an attempt, at least, to reduce the high tensions of the Cold War and make things better. So ultimately, was it a success for containment? On the whole, yeah, it was. However, it wasn't a complete and utter success for containment. As you can see, there are still some things that the United States needs to accept that isn't necessarily in keeping with its policy. It will have to accept a communist Cuba. It will have to accept a degree of Soviet influence in Central and South America, and it will fight against communist revolutions. On the other hand, it had protected itself from the imminent threat of nuclear war, and it ensured that the United States had the upper hand in the arms race, which would, I suppose, in the long term, be a victory for the capitalist system.